Welcome back to the Former Fat Friend podcast. This is Kasey, and today I'm actually here by myself. Well, technically, if you're watching on video, you'll know that Teddy has joined me on the podcast today. And it does feel a little weird to be here without my counterparts, but I wanted to share some important news with all of our listeners. My amazing co-hosts, Allie and Lisa, have decided to take a step back from the podcast. We started talking about planning and coordinating this podcast almost a year ago, actually. And since then, we've put out 24 episodes across 2 seasons, and I am so proud of that. We have also grown an incredible community. We've connected with so many of you, and we've loved every minute of what we've created. When we set out to make this podcast, we wanted to let people in on the conversations that we were just having with each other. We had met through our DMV bariatric meetup group, and we had just had so many amazing conversations around this shared experience of bariatric surgery. And we wanted to let other people in on that. And we wanted to talk about things related to weight loss and surgery and body image and relationships and everything that goes along with that. And I think that's exactly what we've done. What I don't think any of us realized going into this is just how much work it takes to actually make a podcast. From planning to recording to editing, publishing, promoting, all of that takes a lot of hours and a lot of energy. And both Allie and Lisa are now in different seasons of life than when we first started. They have new careers, new family obligations, new relationships that all take priority. So as sad as I am to not have them here with me every week, I'm really proud of their decisions to prioritize their own health and their own well-being. That doesn't mean that you'll never hear from them again. They always have an open microphone here on the Former Fat Friend podcast, and they are going to be back to share important updates and join the conversation when they can. You just won't hear from them every week like you are used to. So what does that mean for the future of the Former Fat Friend podcast? We've always said that we are not experts, right? We can't give you advice. We are not here to pretend that we know anything. We're just sharing our experiences. But there are so many amazing people out there, specifically in this community, who are experts and who are very qualified to give you tangible, actionable advice. And so we're going to be having a lot more guest experts on the podcast. We've already done that somewhat in this season, and we're going to continue to do that more as the podcast goes on. We've also really loved getting to know you guys, part of our Former Fat Friend community. Something that I've learned is just how many unique voices and experiences there are out there. And even though we have a commonality, a shared ground, whether that's bariatric surgery or struggling with obesity and trying to lose weight, we have that shared connection. Everyone's story is so unique and so different, and we all have something that we can learn from each other. So we want to hear more from that community. We are going to be having people on to share their journey with us and to connect our community even further beyond just the 3 of us. We've also learned that while we do have a large bariatric patient community, we also have a lot of people with totally different experiences, people who have not had weight loss surgery, might be using something like a GLP-1 or medication, or haven't had any sort of medical intervention at all. But we think each of those experiences is worth hearing from. So I'm excited to do that. And I promise that you won't be stuck with just me too often. But when you are, I'm going to do what I know how to do best, which is dive into research. If you didn't know, I actually have my PhD in cognitive neuroscience and social psychology, and I spent many, many years conducting and reading and consuming research. I really love understanding the science of obesity and the treatment for it. So I'm going to help break down some of that research for you when I think it might be relevant or interesting. So today, I'm going to do just that, and I'm going to be talking about the hot topic of regain. I think everyone who has had weight loss surgery has heard someone say, oh, my brother's uncle's sister's mom had weight loss surgery and she gained it all back, right? And while I think generally that's a silly thing to say to someone, regain is very real. And a lot of bariatric patients struggle with regain after surgery. In fact, I think anyone who has lost a lot of weight struggles with regain after significant weight loss. And so it is something that we want to talk about and we want to understand a little bit better. And I was really curious what the research says about this. So I'm going to talk about that and kind of break that down for you. I'm going to start by comparing bariatric surgery with other weight loss methods. I also want to talk about exploring factors that predict success after bariatric surgery. There's some really interesting research around this, and especially around expectations for success after surgery. That was something that I wasn't expecting to read in the research that I thought was so fascinating. And then finally, I want to talk about the research on regain. How likely is it that weight loss surgery patients regain their weight? What does regain look like? What predicts regain? How can you treat regain? All of that stuff is super interesting and super relevant to bariatric patients. And so I wanted to talk about it all. So to get started, let's talk about success rates after bariatric surgery. I think in the medical community and across all of research, bariatric surgery truly is considered the gold standard of a metabolic surgery for the treatment of obesity. It is the most effective compared to other methods. And I think when we say most effective, we're not just talking about the amount of weight that someone can lose, but we're actually talking about long-term success with weight loss. So there was a study published in JAMA Surgery in 2020, and the title is Bariatric Surgery and Long-Term Durability of Weight Loss. And the general finding there, this was just gastric bypass patients, but what they found was that they lost 25 to 30% of their body weight on average, which is an incredible amount to lose. But they also sustained that for up to 10 years in this particular study. And they compared that to a non-surgical group, and that non-surgical group only maintained about a 5% loss. So even when people without surgery were able to lose close to the amount of bariatric surgery patients, they weren't able to sustain that weight loss. And I think that's huge. And this is actually something that I was really interested in when I chose to have weight loss surgery, was because I knew the statistics. I knew the likelihood of losing weight naturally. I'm using air quotes if you're not watching video, but losing weight without medical intervention, even if you can do it, and it's really hard, very few people can, but even if you can, the likelihood of keeping that off long term is so low. It's just so low that it felt nearly impossible. And I know everyone wants to think that like they're going to be the exception, not the rule, but that's not how statistics work. And so I knew that. I knew that I was most likely not going to be the exception. I was going to be the rule. And so without something like weight loss surgery, I wasn't likely to keep any significant weight off. But with weight loss surgery, those results are actually a lot higher. There's also a really interesting study that was published just in 2023, and it was a meta-analysis of 11 different studies, and they looked at randomized controlled trials. So randomized controlled trials are the most scientifically rigorous types of studies that you can have. And they wanted to see, when we really control for these like really tightly controlled studies, we look at these kind of gold standard research studies and we compare bariatric surgery with lifestyle changes alone. What do we actually see? So across those 11 studies, they did find, similar to the previous study, that bariatric surgery had a significantly higher sustained weight loss than lifestyle changes alone. There was also a really cool study published in 2018. This was a 7-year longitudinal study. So they followed bariatric patients for 7 years, which is fantastic. What they found, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later when I talk about factors predicting regain and success, but what I wanted to mention here is that across that patient population, and there were several thousand, across that patient population, across all 7 years, most people did maintain their weight, and they noted that they had different trajectories, right? So weight loss didn't stay constant across the 7 years. People didn't weigh the exact same every single day for 7 years of their life after, reaching their maintenance weight of bariatric surgery. They followed different trajectories, but what they said was that most people maintained their weight with normal variation. So expected variation when you have a baby, when you go into menopause. These are expected variations with weight, but for the most part, people were actually able to maintain within that normal variation, which is really fantastic. So how does that compare with other methods? I found a study. This is another meta-analysis that basically takes the results of several different studies. This is 29 different long-term weight loss studies, and these were non-surgical patients. So this was lifestyle intervention alone. This was not medical or surgical intervention. This was just quote unquote natural weight loss. And what they found, which is very disheartening, is that more than half of the weight that had been lost for these people was regained within 2 years. And by 5 years, more than 80% of the lost weight was regained. So without medical intervention, people really just are not able to maintain long-term weight loss. So I think, taken together, I think what this tells me is that weight loss is tough, and it's tough no matter how you do it. And long-term successful weight loss is not guaranteed, but your odds are much, much higher when you do something like bariatric surgery. Now, I do want to say we are just on the cusp of these new GLP-1 medications being used to treat obesity. So I don't think that we have really robust data. We certainly don't have enough data yet to do things like these 7-year longitudinal studies, or even some of the more robust meta-analyses that we have for bariatric surgery. But I think these are really promising in terms of sustained weight loss, with the key being that people do need continued treatment, right? So I think with medication, if you stop it, and they've shown this in some of the clinical trials for the drug companies that are making these, that when people do stop the medication, they do regain the weight. Not as much as they lost, but they do regain a significant amount. But if they're able to stay on medications in maintenance doses, they're able to maintain that weight loss for a really long time. And so I think that's a very promising avenue for the treatment of obesity. So we know that weight loss without intervention, really, really tough to maintain that long term. Statistically, most people will regain nearly all of the weight they lose. With bariatric surgery, those odds really improve. And with GLP-1 medications, it appears those odds would really improve as well. So I think one thing that's really interesting to think about is what predicts how successful someone is going to be after they have weight loss surgery, both in the initial phase and also in the long-term phase. So I found this really interesting study. It's called Preoperative Predictors of Weight Loss and Weight Regain Following Gastric Bypass Surgery. And so what they wanted to look at was, what are some of the factors we can identify before someone even goes into surgery to help us understand, number one, how much weight do we think they're going to lose after surgery? And number two, how likely are they to be successful long-term in maintaining that weight loss? So they took a cohort of people. The average age was about 45, and the initial body mass index was also about 45. So I just mentioned that to say these were obese patients, but not morbidly, severely, I think a lot of times when people think about gastric bypass patients, certainly not our community, but outside of our community, you think about people with BMIs in like the 70s and 80s. This is a more moderately obese population. Just wanted to mention that. So what they found was that the average percentage of weight loss for these patients was 35% of their total body weight. Again, that's huge. That is an incredibly successful amount. But the most interesting part of this study was that they were looking at some of those baseline factors, those preoperative things that people had before surgery that predicted how much weight they ended up losing. Here's what they found. So higher baseline fasting ghrelin was associated with more weight loss. Higher baseline fasting ghrelin was associated with more weight loss. So this is interesting, right? Because ghrelin is the hunger hormone, and we know that weight loss surgery reduces ghrelin. And so it's interesting to think about, maybe that's a factor that for those people led to their obesity, and they have a more positive response to an intervention that turns down that factor. Very, very interesting. They also found that lower age was associated with more weight loss. So the younger someone is, the more likely they are to lose more weight. And this was actually something I saw across studies that were looking at factors. Age was a huge predictor of how much weight someone loses after bariatric surgery. Also, lower A1C. Again, this is consistently shown across studies. Lower A1C and negative type 2 diabetes status are both associated with greater weight loss after bariatric surgery. They also did a subgroup analysis of type 2 diabetes patients, and they found that higher ghrelin and glucagon were both associated with greater weight loss. which is super interesting. So it looks like, according to this study, there are just a really complex combination of biological and hormonal markers that may help in developing more accurate predictive models when it comes to weight loss following bariatric surgery. What I think is super interesting about this, from a patient perspective, is understanding that as much as there is some of this that is within your control, so things like adherence to bariatric surgery postoperative guidelines certainly can have an effect. And I'll talk about that shortly with the research. What this also tells me is that there is so much that is outside of our control. And I think I've always known this, right, before I read it in this research, but this really just confirms it, that, you have no control over what your, baseline fasting ghrelin level is. You have no control over that. You can't control that. And that's going to affect how you respond to bariatric surgery. And so I think that's something we need to keep in mind as bariatric surgery patients, is that we can only control what we can. And there are things outside of our control that are going to influence how much weight we lose, what weight we get down to. And it's important to kind of manage your expectations around that. Okay, so I wanted to talk about another article, and I think this one's really interesting. So this one was published in 2023. And it is in the Journal of Obesity and Metabolic Syndromes. And they also find a variety of different factors that are associated with weight loss after bariatric surgery. So I'll tell you about some of those, but then there's also another thing that I want to talk about. So first, what they find is that starting BMI predicts ending BMI. So patients that start with a higher body mass index tend to end up with a higher body mass index than those who start on the lower end, even though the amount of weight that they lose may be higher. Again, they find the effect of age, so older patients tend to lose less. They also cite some interesting effects of gender, where some studies show that women may actually lose more weight after bariatric surgery than men, but they do note that these results are mixed. They also find the same effect of diabetes. What they also find here is that mental health is a really important factor. So people with depression and anxiety tend to lose less weight than those without. And people with any sort of eating disorders also tend to lose less weight than those without. And the type of procedure matters here. Specifically, patients who have gastric bypass surgery typically lose more weight than patients who have gastric sleeve surgery. But one of the things I thought was really interesting about this paper is they talk about the gap between patient weight loss expectations and actual weight loss. And so they did this study where they asked people, this was patients who had gastric sleeve surgery, or they were candidates for gastric sleeve surgery. They asked them what they thought they would achieve in terms of weight loss. And they separated that into like what their dream weight loss goal was, where they'd be happy at, or what they would consider acceptable, and then anything that they would consider unacceptable. So what they found was that almost all of the patients said that they believed they would achieve their dream, happy, or acceptable weight loss by 1 year post-op, but that was significantly higher than what was clinically expected for those patients. What they also found was that most of these patients reported that they would be disappointed with an expected weight loss of about 40%, which roughly corresponds to a 20% total weight loss. And most surgeons said that they would be very, very happy with that outcome for their patients. So where patients said, I won't be happy if I only lose this much, medical professionals are saying, I'd be thrilled for my patient. My patient would be a success. And so I think it's a really interesting point about the gap in expectations between medically expected outcomes, medically positive outcomes, and what patients actually want. The other thing that they mention here is that unrealistic weight loss expectations can actually negatively affect treatment adherence, because I think if you have this expectation that you're going to lose a certain amount of weight by 1 year post-op, as you start getting to that 1 year post-op, if you haven't met that, you may feel really defeated. You may feel like you failed and you're like, well, what's the point? I'm just going to throw in the towel. I don't care anymore. And you just kind of quit. And that's really where some of the issues with regain come in, is when people don't adhere to those post-op guidelines. And so I think it's an interesting point that I've never really thought about from the standpoint of success or long-term success of bariatric surgery, right, is that I think we all know that we all probably want to lose more weight than statistically we are likely to lose. I think bariatric surgery, 6% of excess weight loss ranges from like 60 to 80%. Most people want to lose more than that, but I've never really thought about it in the context of how that could affect regain. And it makes sense that has a really tremendously negative effect on your psyche if you feel like you failed. I know if I felt like I had failed and I felt like I was just kind of spinning my wheels, it would be difficult to stick to this lifestyle. And so I think that's something that we need to give a little bit more thought to when we talk about regain is like, what were the expectations that you had and were those reasonable? Okay, so now that I think we've kind of set the stage with, how successful is bariatric surgery compared to other weight loss methods? What are some of the things that contribute to success post-op? I want to talk about regain. And I want to start by saying that I was one of those people who naively said after I lost a bunch of weight, oh, I'll never regain my weight. If I'll weigh myself every single day for the rest of my life. If I start to see the weight go up, I'll just make a change and I'll get it back on track and I'll never regain my weight. And in March of this year, I started to regain. And it wasn't a lot. It got to be about 8 or 9 pounds, I think, at one point, which doesn't sound like a lot. It was a lot for me at the time. But I think what was really kind of shocking about it is that I didn't feel like I had changed anything. And the scale was just going up and up and up. And it felt so outside of my control. And I felt like such a jerk for being that person who was like, I'll never regain weight. Like, I don't know, these people who regain, it must be their fault. They just didn't keep it in check, because I felt like I couldn't control it. And it was a humbling moment for me. I remember getting on my Instagram stories and basically saying, I'm sorry if I've ever said anything to make you feel like I thought it was your fault for regaining, because I now understand how disheartening it feels to watch the scale go up and just genuinely not understand why. I still now don't really understand what changed, other than maybe a little bit of stress, or, maybe things that had changed in my life that hadn't quite registered on my radar as having changed. But nonetheless, it did feel like, the only way I can describe it is it felt like the only way for me to kind of rein it in and lose weight was to go to an extreme, because I had developed this really good sense of balance in maintenance. I had been maintaining my weight for a really long time, like within a couple pound range. My weight did not fluctuate at all. And I had so much freedom when it came to food. I did not track my food. Exercise was a bonus, right? It made me feel good, and it was good for that, but I didn't feel like I needed to exercise to maintain my weight. I had ebbs and flows. I had periods where I moved a lot. I had periods where I moved less, and my weight didn't really change. I tended to want to eat healthier foods, and I liked eating higher protein and veggies. I liked how it made me feel, but I also could eat basically whatever I wanted and not gain weight. So I had so much freedom, right? And I had gotten so used to that freedom. And then all of a sudden, it felt like I didn't know what I was doing anymore. And watching the scale go up and up and up, and being like, how do I still enjoy this freedom that meant so much to me after spending my entire life on a diet? But also, how do I get this regain in check? So yeah, I have a lot of empathy for people who experience regain. I'm glad I went through that experience, because I think it made me rethink about how I think about regain. And I also recognize now that there are going to be things throughout my life that are going to cause my weight to fluctuate, and I need to be able to accept that as they happen. It is not realistic that my weight is going to stay within a 2-pound range for the rest of my life. It's just not. So anyway, so that's kind of like my personal anecdote. So as far as what I did to lose that regain, instead of going to an extreme where it felt like I don't know what else to do except just cut out all carbs and sugar and track every single morsel that goes into my mouth. I opted to just not do that, and I made very small changes. So I started walking a lot more. Walking has always been one thing that I feel like leads to weight loss for me. So I started really upping my walking and honestly just kind of focusing back to basics. And it wasn't anything crazy. I think it was a combination of, very small changes and also maybe just some natural stress decreasing or whatever it was. The weight did eventually drop back off, and that's great. But it was definitely it was a tough couple of months to try to deal with that and to figure out, exactly how to address it. And I know it's something that a lot of people deal with. So I know from anecdotally from my interactions within our community that a lot of people struggle with regain, but I wanted to see what the statistics were. And so here's what I found. So around 20 to 30% of patients will regain at least 10% of their weight within 3 to 5 years post-surgery. So 20 to 30% of patients regain at least 10%. Now, 10% is a lot. 10% is not a small amount. But what they do note here is that the amount of weight regain typically doesn't bring patients anywhere close to their pre-surgery weight, which is good news and kind of goes back to that long-term success. So even when we have those variations in weight over time, most bariatric patients are still successful in the long run. The other thing that was noted in some of this research is that we actually don't really understand the extent of weight regain in bariatric populations because we don't really have good long-term follow-ups. Most surgeons don't see their patients past 1 to 2 years post-op, and so we actually don't have a lot of data on weight regain. We also don't have a good standardized measure of what it means to regain weight. So there are different schools of thought in terms of, what we would consider regain. And I'm sure anyone who's a bariatric patient, I'm sure has heard this, that, you might hit your lowest weight and then come back up a little bit. And that's totally normal. So depending on how you actually define weight regain, some of those rates can range anywhere from 9% to 91% in the same cohort of people, just by using a slightly different definition of weight regain. So I think it's important to know that one, we don't actually know as much as we should about regain because we don't follow people for long enough. And two, we also don't really understand what weight regain really means. And I think about this in the terms of like when you are newly post-op and you're in a stall. Right? When you start losing weight, you're losing weight like every single day. You get on the scale and every single day you're dropping weight. And then the first time that you don't lose weight for 2, 3, 4 days, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm in a stall. And if you say that to anyone who's had bariatric surgery or a dietitian or whoever, they're going to be like, yeah, 4 days is not a stall. Like, calm down, you're fine. I think the same is true of regain, where we probably don't have a good sense of like, what is the calm down, you're fine amount of regain and what is true regain. I couldn't really find a consensus in the literature, and I think it's probably something that that still needs to be studied. But it seems to me, based on what I've read, that some amount of regain is normal after bariatric surgery. The higher amounts of regain are probably not considered not normal, but not ideal. But it is not expected that you would stay at your lowest weight forever. Just want to put that out there. Okay, so this study that I'm looking at is in the Journal of Clinical Medicine. It was published in 2023, and there are a couple of things that they talk about that are predictors in weight regain. And I think one of the first ones that I want to touch on is stuff that is outside of the patient's control, and that is surgical factors. So these are things that your surgeon may have done or not done that can contribute to weight regain. So they find that a small gastric volume does appear to be a key factor in reaching and maintaining long-term weight loss. So when you talk about something like a sleeve, the bougie size, which is the tool that they use to determine the size of your stomach, that size really matters. They also find that the distance between the pylorus and the first staple line should be as short as possible to have effective gastric emptying and to minimize a reservoir. And then they also find that secondary gastric dilation, this is also known as stomach stretching after bariatric surgery seems to influence weight regain, especially after gastric bypass, but it can also happen after gastric sleeve surgery. And so I wanted to mention these first because I think it's so important when we talk about weight regain to try to understand that some of this might not be our fault. And I have talked to a lot of people online through my platform and had so many conversations with people. And a lot of them end up finding that their surgeries weren't done correctly in the first place. And so they're struggling with all this regain. They're being told, oh, you just need to eat less. You got to prioritize protein more, blah, blah, blah. And then as it turns out, they, didn't have, their stomach wasn't made small enough to begin with. They left a portion of the stomach that shouldn't have been left. And so long story short, there are a lot of surgical factors that can contribute to weight regain. And I would suggest that if you are struggling with significant regain and it's not making sense why, I would advocate for yourself to have some of those things checked. You can do tests to see if you have had any gastric dilation or what the size of your stomach is, and you can understand kind of what's going on surgically and if there's something that you should be doing there. But I think it's important to note that there are some factors, and the research finds that there are factors that are not related to patient adherence. There are, of course, factors that are related to patient adherence. And what they find in this study is that several patterns of disordered eating can predict weight regain. So they find grazing is one of the number one behaviors that predicts weight regain. Binge eating, which in bariatric populations is often called loss of control eating. They also find that night eating syndrome is related to weight regain. And then in general, what they find is that patient compliance is absolutely crucial to weight maintenance. So I think, when I kind of think about this for myself, I like to say that I live my life pretty normally now. I'm 3 years post-op. I have lost all of the weight that I want to lose. I've maintained that weight loss for 2 years now. And so I like to say, oh, I live pretty normally. But when I actually stop to think about it, I don't live at all like I did pre-surgery. The way that I think about food, the way that I prioritize certain macronutrients before others, like always eating protein first, the way I prioritize hydration and movement, this is all fundamentally different than how I was before. And I think that is a key aspect of maintaining weight loss. And that's what all of the research shows. And I'll also mention that research shows this study and a couple of others that follow-up care was crucial. And I think that's such a missing piece for so many people, myself included. Not having good follow-up care post-bariatric surgery makes it really, really difficult to maintain your weight. The other thing that I wanted to mention about this study is that they do talk about the role of drug therapy in bariatric populations as well as revision surgery. And what they find in this study is that revision surgery, they think, should be a last resort, and that some of the outcomes are not as promising as you would hope, and that actually drug therapy seems to be more promising than revision surgery for bariatric patients struggling with weight regain, with the caveat, and this is a big caveat, that it needs longer term studies and it needs more people. So we have a lot of data on GLP-1s in patients with obesity and patients with type 2 diabetes. We don't have a lot of research on post-bariatric surgery patients. And what this paper talks about is basically says, hey, this looks really promising. Based on the data we do have, we think that actually GLP-1s are probably a better fit for dealing with weight regain long-term than revision surgery. But we need more data to really understand that. But I think that's such a promising thing for bariatric populations. And we've talked about this before on this podcast, but I think a lot of times people really believe that bariatric surgery is the last resort. And I fell into this camp too, right? Where I said, if I can't lose weight with this, like I'm just doomed to be fat forever. There's just no hope for me. If this doesn't work, this is it. I'm so grateful that it did, but I also understand now that it is absolutely not the last resort. And there are so many people who need adjunct therapy and adjunct treatment. And I think we are at such an exciting time in the world when it comes to the treatment of obesity, where we have drugs like GLP-1s that that can be added to this treatment for bariatric patients so that it doesn't have to be the last resort. And that if you don't lose all of the weight that you wanted to lose, like that's okay. You're not a failure. Or if you regain some weight, because that's life and life happens and that's expected, that you have a path, you have a solution to help you. And you're not kind of in this mindset of like, this is it. This is, last resort. If this doesn't work, it's all over for me. The last thing I wanted to touch on, because it's something that is near and dear to my heart, and I was very happy to see this in the research, is the role of social support in long-term success and preventing weight regain after bariatric surgery. So there's a study in BMG Open. It's a qualitative study, and they look at people who have had weight loss surgery, and they look at those who have had weight regain versus those who haven't. What they find is that patients with strong social connections, so these are family connections, friend connections, or even with healthcare providers, report better adherence to post-surgery lifestyle changes. And these post-surgery lifestyle changes are critical in predicting long-term weight maintenance. And so what they conclude is that social support provides that emotional encouragement. It provides that accountability, which really helps patients stay committed to those dietary and exercise guidelines, which ultimately reduces the likelihood of weight regain. There is another study, the one that I mentioned at the top of this podcast, which was the 7-year longitudinal study of bariatric patients. They found a very similar effect where patients who had a strong social and professional support system that included regular follow-up visits showed better long-term weight maintenance. And again, this was over 7 years. And what they find is that those social support systems help patients to adhere better to the post-surgery lifestyle guidelines. And that's what helps mitigate weight regain. Interestingly, in this study, they found that those social support systems were most crucial between the 3rd and 7th year after surgery, which I found so interesting because I'm right at year 3 and I'm like, okay. But it kind of makes sense because when I think about the last 3 years, I think adherence to the post-op lifestyle guidelines through, nutrition, movement, hydration, all of that stuff. I don't want to say that it was easy for the first year, but it was easier in the sense that like I had to do it. I everything was brand new. I didn't know what I could tolerate. I could barely eat anything at first. It was a slow process. So it was almost like a forced adherence to those dietary guidelines. Now that I'm 3 years out, I truly feel like I can do whatever I want. I mean, I certainly can't eat the volume that I could eat before, but I can eat whatever foods I want to. I can drink alcohol. I can do all of the things that I want to do. And so adherence to those lifestyle changes is really more about choice at this point. And so I can see where social support really becomes crucial because if I didn't have anybody in my life who either knew that I had bariatric surgery or supported the fact that I had bariatric surgery, I can imagine that it would be really easy to just sort of like fall into the I'm just living like everybody else kind of lifestyle. I think about drinking a lot for me. I don't drink very often at all. It's for a lot of reasons, but I think for me, it's like a cascading effect of alcohol. So one, you have a lot of excess calories in alcohol. Every time I drink, I want to eat a lot while I'm drinking. And I do eat a lot while I'm drinking. And then the next day I feel like garbage. And so then I'm hungover and then I want, to eat all the food to help me feel better from being hungover. So it's like, and then I don't want to work out. I don't want to go for my walks. So it's for me, it's like, it's not just the drink that's a problem. It's like everything that kind of falls after that is a problem. So I don't really drink. I might once in a while have a fancy cocktail if we're at like a really cool cocktail bar or a nice restaurant or whatever, but I generally don't drink. And most people in my life, actually everyone in my life, supports me in that. I think because they understand that I have had bariatric surgery, I've lost 105 pounds, my lifestyle is different now, and they support that. it would be so easy to fall back into old habits and old patterns if you didn't have people in your corner supporting you in those things. And so I think that's such an interesting finding that between year 3 and 7, it becomes really crucial. I also say this a lot about my Instagram community, but I think that's been a huge part of my success longer term is that because I show up on the internet for 100 and however many thousand people, who are watching this journey, I feel really accountable to stick to my goals and to stick to these lifestyle changes. And if I didn't have to show up every day and, talk about things that I'm doing and the foods that I'm eating and the workouts that I'm doing, I think it would be a lot easier to sort of like let things slip and let things slide. And so having those support systems is so crucial. We talked about this a couple weeks ago with Dr. Steve, and he mentioned this too. And I think this is such an important thing. Social support is absolutely critical for preventing weight regain, dealing with weight regain. And I think you need to find that wherever you can. If it's with your family and your friends, that's amazing. If your surgery center has support groups, that's also amazing. I think if you can find local meetup groups, like the one that we started here in the DC area, I know there are a lot of other societies and things like that. Those are fantastic. And even if it's just on the internet, if it's just starting a little burner account on Instagram, connecting with people there, I promise that it has a more profound impact than you can even imagine. So social support is absolutely crucial. It's something I'm so passionate about, and I truly, truly believe has made a huge difference in my own journey. So I hope that was interesting. I found it really interesting diving into some of that research and trying to understand some of these factors that predict success, long-term success, and weight regain. I know this is a tough conversation, especially as bariatric patients, but it's something that I think we need to be educated on. And so I hope this helped enlighten some of that for you. If you want to find the podcast on social media, we are at Former Fat Friend Pod. We also have video podcasts, so we're on YouTube at Former Fat Friend Podcast. I'm at Maintaining Kasey. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok. If you like this podcast, we would love it if you could leave us a review, share it with a friend. It means the world to us, and we're so, so glad you're here and part of this community. And we will see you next time. Bye.